The autumn sun cast long shadows across Riverside High's football field as 17-year-old Marcus Thompson jogged toward the locker room after practice. His jersey clung to his muscular frame, soaked with sweat from another grueling session under Coach Williams' watchful eye. Marcus was the star quarterback, the golden boy who could throw a perfect spiral 40 yards downfield, and had college scouts already knocking on his door. As team captain, Marcus had grown accustomed to the admiration that followed him through the hallways. Teachers smiled when he passed, underclassmen stepped aside respectfully, and his teammates looked up to him both on and off the field. The attention had slowly inflated his ego over the years, transforming a once humble kid into someone who believed his own hype a little too much. Walking through the school parking lot, Marcus spotted an old pickup truck with faded paint and a bumper sticker that read Vietnam Veteran. Behind the wheel sat an elderly man with weathered hands and tired eyes, waiting patiently as students streamed past. The man's gray hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, he sat with the straight posture of someone who had once served his country with pride. This was Robert Shun, a 68-year-old veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning home to a country that didn't always welcome its soldiers with open arms. For the past 3 years, Robert had worked part-time as a janitor at Riverside High, quietly going about his duties while most students barely noticed his presence. He took pride in keeping the school clean, treating even the smallest tasks with the same dedication he had once brought to his military service. Marcus had seen Robert around school countless times, always pushing his cart of cleaning supplies through the hallways or wiping down tables in the cafeteria. To Marcus, the old man was just part of the background, invisible help that made his world run smoothly. The teenager had never bothered to learn Robert's name or acknowledge his presence beyond the occasional dismissive glance. That particular afternoon, as Robert waited for his shift to end, he watched the young athletes heading home after their practice. He remembered being their age once, full of energy and dreams before life, and war had taught him about sacrifice and service. There was something about their youthful confidence that both inspired and saddened him, reminding him of the innocence he had lost decades ago. Marcus approached his own car, a brand-new sports sedan that his parents had bought him for his 17th birthday. As he fumbled with his keys, he noticed several of his teammates gathering around, their voices loud and boisterous as they recounted plays from practice. The group's energy was infectious, and Marcus felt the familiar rush of being at the center of attention. "Did you guys see the throw I made in the end zone?" Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Coach said it was the best spiral he'd seen all season. His teammates laughed and cheered, feeding into Marcus's growing sense of superiority. The praise felt intoxicating, and he found himself craving more validation, more proof that he was special and different from everyone else around him. As the group continued their celebration, Marcus's eyes fell once again on Robert's old truck. Something about the vehicle's shabby appearance bothered him, as if its presence somehow diminished the perfection of his own success. The contrast between his shiny new car and the veteran's beat-up vehicle struck him as almost offensive, a reminder that not everyone in his world lived up to his standards. Without fully understanding why, Marcus felt a surge of irritation toward the old man. Perhaps it was the way Robert sat so quietly, seemingly unimpressed by the teenage athlete's achievements. Or maybe it was simply that the veteran's humble presence made Marcus feel the need to assert his dominance, to prove that he was better than those around him. The other students began to disperse, heading to their own vehicles and making plans for the evening. Marcus stood beside his car, his hand on the door handle, but something held him back. The sight of Robert's truck continued to bother him, like a small stone in his shoe that he couldn't ignore. His teammates were still within earshot, close enough to witness whatever he might do next. The thought of performing for their entertainment, of cementing his status as someone who commanded respect and attention, began to take root in his mind. Marcus had always been good at reading a room, at knowing exactly what would get the biggest reaction from his audience. Robert remained oblivious to the teenager's growing agitation, simply sitting in his truck and watching the world go by. He had learned long ago to keep to himself, to avoid drawing unnecessary attention that might lead to uncomfortable questions about his past or his current circumstances. All he wanted was to finish his shift and go home to his small apartment, where he could spend the evening reading or watching old movies that reminded him of simpler times. The parking lot was beginning to empty as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting everything in a golden glow that should have been peaceful. Instead, tension was building in Marcus's chest, a restless energy that demanded release. He looked around at his remaining teammates, calculating whether they would appreciate what he was considering. Marcus had never been particularly cruel or malicious, but privilege and praise had slowly eroded his empathy over the years. He had grown accustomed to getting what he wanted when he wanted it, and the idea that anyone might not recognize his importance felt like a personal affront. The old janitor's quiet dignity somehow challenged his worldview, suggesting that there were forms of worth that had nothing to do with athletic ability or social status. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He stepped away from his car and began walking toward Robert's truck, his teammates following with curious expressions. None of them could have predicted what was about to happen, or how a single moment of poor judgment would set in motion a series of events that would teach them all about respect, consequence, and the true meaning of strength. Marcus approached Robert's truck with a swagger that had become his signature walk, his teammates trailing behind like eager spectators waiting for entertainment. The elderly veteran noticed the group approaching and rolled down his window slightly, assuming they might need directions or have some innocent question about school facilities. "Hey, old man," Marcus called out, his voice deliberately loud enough for his friends to hear. "Nice ride you got there. Did you find it in a junkyard?" Robert's weathered face showed no immediate reaction, though his grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. He had encountered this type of disrespect before, usually from people who had never faced real hardship or understood the value of hard work. Still, he maintained his composure, hoping the boy would move along without further incident. "Is there something I can help you with, son?" Robert asked quietly, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had learned to defuse difficult situations. Marcus's teammates snickered at the question, emboldened by their leader's apparent dominance over the situation. The laughter fed Marcus's ego, making him feel powerful and in control. He had their attention now, and he wasn't ready to give it up. "Help me?" Marcus laughed mockingly. "What could an old janitor possibly do to help me? I'm going to play college football next year, maybe even go pro. You're just here to clean up after people like me." The words hung in the air like a physical weight, their cruelty evident even to Marcus's teammates, some of whom shifted uncomfortably. Robert's eyes flashed with something that might have been pain or anger, but he kept his voice steady when he responded. "Everyone has their role to play, young man. There's no shame in honest work." "Honest work?" Marcus scoffed, stepping closer to the truck. "You mean like being a janitor at a high school? That's what happens when you don't have any real skills or ambition. Good thing I'll never end up like you." What Marcus didn't know, and what Robert had never shared with anyone at the school, was that the man sitting before him had once led soldiers through some of the most dangerous terrain in Southeast Asia. Robert had earned 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Silver Star for Valor during his service in Vietnam. He had saved lives, shown incredible courage under fire, and returned home to a country that often treated its veterans as unwanted reminders of an unpopular war. After the military, Robert had worked as a successful construction foreman for 30 years, building homes and commercial buildings throughout the state. He had raised 2 children as a single father after his wife passed away from cancer, putting both kids through college with his hard-earned savings. The janitorial job at Riverside High wasn't a reflection of failure or a lack of ambition. It was how he stayed active and useful in his retirement years, giving him a sense of purpose and connection to the community. But Marcus saw none of this history, none of the sacrifice and service that had defined Robert's life. All he saw was an easy target, someone he could mock to elevate himself in front of his friends. The teenager's vision had been narrowed by privilege and youth, making him blind to the dignity and worth of the man before him. You know what I think? Marcus continued, his voice growing more aggressive. I think you're just a loser who couldn't make it in the real world. That's why you're stuck cleaning bathrooms and mopping floors. Probably why you ended up in the military too. Couldn't handle civilian life. The mention of his military service struck Robert like a physical blow. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the careful control he had maintained for decades threatened to slip. Images flashed through his mind. Friends who had died in his arms, villages they had tried to protect, the sound of helicopters coming to evacuate the wounded. The suggestion that his service had been some kind of failure or escape was almost unbearable. Marcus's teammates had gone quiet now, sensing that their leader had crossed a line they weren't comfortable with. A few of them exchanged worried glances, recognizing that what had started as harmless teasing had turned into something uglier. But none of them had the courage to speak up, too afraid of losing their status within the group or facing Marcus's wrath themselves. Son, Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper, you don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think I do. Marcus shot back, his confidence growing with each cruel word. I see guys like you all the time, washed up, forgotten, trying to hang around kids because your own life is so pathetic. Well, guess what? Nobody cares about whatever sob story you're carrying around. This is my school, and people like you are just here to serve people like me. The parking lot had grown quieter as other students stopped to watch the confrontation. Word was spreading through social media, with several phones now recording the interaction. Marcus was too caught up in his performance to notice the growing audience, but Robert could see the crowd forming and understood that whatever happened next would have consequences far beyond this moment. Robert took a deep breath, drawing on the same inner strength that had carried him through combat and personal tragedy. He could have responded with anger, could have told this arrogant boy about the medals in his closet or the men he had saved under enemy fire. Instead, he chose the path of dignity, refusing to let Marcus's ignorance drag him down to a lower level. I hope someday you understand that a person's worth isn't measured by their job or their circumstances, Robert said quietly. Real strength comes from how you treat others, especially those who can't fight back. Marcus laughed harshly, mistaking Robert's restraint for weakness. Save the sermon, old man. Nobody wants to hear your life lessons. Why don't you just drive your piece of junk truck home and let the important people handle things here? What Marcus didn't notice was Coach Williams emerging from the school building, having been alerted by another teacher who had witnessed the beginning of the confrontation. The coach had been looking for Marcus to discuss strategy for the upcoming game against their biggest rivals. But now he found himself watching his star player demonstrate a side of his character that was deeply troubling. Coach Williams had served briefly in the military himself before pursuing education, and he recognized the bearing and dignity of a veteran even from a distance. He could see the pain in Robert's eyes, the way the old man held himself with quiet pride despite the verbal assault he was enduring. The coach also noticed his other players standing around like spectators at a cruel entertainment, none of them willing to intervene on behalf of basic human decency. As Marcus prepared to deliver another insult, convinced that he had found the perfect victim to demonstrate his superiority, he remained completely unaware that his actions were being witnessed by the one person whose opinion could change everything. The moment that would define his immediate future was approaching rapidly, and the consequences of his choices were about to become devastatingly clear. Coach Williams approached the scene with measured steps, his expression growing darker with each cruel word that came out of Marcus's mouth. The coach had spent 15 years building young men's character alongside their athletic skills, and what he was witnessing went against everything he had tried to teach his players about respect, humility, and leadership. Marcus was in full swing now, completely absorbed in his verbal assault. You know what the difference is between us? He sneered at Robert. I matter. People know my name. They come and watch me play. They respect me. You're nobody. You're invisible. When you die, nobody will even notice you're gone. The words cut through Robert like a knife, not because they held any truth, but because they revealed the depth of Marcus's ignorance about service and sacrifice. Robert thought about his fallen comrades, young men who had given everything for their country and whose names were etched on a black wall in Washington. He thought about his late wife, who had told him every day that he was her hero. He thought about his children, who called him regularly to thank him for the sacrifices he had made to give them better lives. Marcus Thompson. Coach Williams's voice cut through the air like a whip crack, causing the teenager to spin around in surprise. The coach's face was a mask of controlled fury, his jaw set in a way that made even the bravest players nervous. "Coach." Marcus's demeanor changed instantly, his cruel confidence evaporating as he realized he had been caught. I heard exactly what you were doing," Coach Williams interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "Get away from that truck. Now." Marcus stepped back, his face flushing red as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. His teammates scattered like leaves in the wind, suddenly finding urgent reasons to be anywhere else. The other students who had been watching began to disperse as well, sensing that something serious was about to happen. Coach Williams walked over to Robert's truck and extended his hand through the open window. "Sir, I'm Tom Williams, the football coach here. I want to apologize for what just happened. That behavior doesn't represent our school or our program." Robert shook the coach's hand, noting the firm grip and the genuine respect in the man's eyes. "Robert Chun," he replied simply, "and thank you, but an apology isn't necessary. The boy is young. Sometimes young people make mistakes. With respect, Mr. Chun, what I just witnessed wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, and choices have consequences." Coach Williams turned to face Marcus, who stood frozen beside his car like a deer caught in headlights. Marcus had never seen his coach look so disappointed or angry. The man who had been his mentor, his biggest supporter, and his pathway to a college scholarship was now staring at him with something approaching disgust. The teenager opened his mouth to offer an explanation or excuse, but no words came out. 20 years ago, I served in the Gulf War for 8 months, Coach Williams said, his voice carrying to every student still within earshot. It wasn't a long deployment, and I never saw combat, but it taught me something about the men and women who serve our country. They deserve our respect, regardless of their age, their current circumstances, or their position in life. Robert started to object, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but Coach Williams held up a hand. "Mr. Chun, I don't know your story, but I recognize a veteran when I see one. The way you carry yourself, the way you handled that disrespect with dignity, those are the qualities we should be teaching our young people." Marcus felt his world beginning to crumble around him. The coach who had promised him everything, who had been in contact with college recruiters, who had made him feel invincible, was now looking at him like he was a stranger. The other students were staring too, their expressions ranging from shock to disappointment to something that looked like pity. "Coach, I can explain," Marcus began desperately. "Explain what?" Coach Williams's voice was cold. "Explain how my team captain, the young man I've been holding up as an example of leadership, just spent 10 minutes verbally abusing an elderly man who works at our school. Explain how the player I've been recommending to college scouts just demonstrated that he has no character, no respect, and no understanding of what it means to be a decent human being." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He had never considered that his actions might have consequences beyond the immediate moment. In his mind, he was untouchable, protected by his talent and his status as the star of the team. The possibility that Coach Williams might actually punish him had never occurred to him. Robert cleared his throat gently. "Coach Williams, I appreciate your support, but the boy is 17 years old," Coach Williams interrupted. "Old enough to drive, old enough to make decisions, and old enough to be held accountable for those decisions. What he did today tells me everything I need to know about his character, and character is what separates good players from great leaders." Marcus's teammates, who had been watching from a safe distance, began to understand the severity of the situation. They had all participated in the cruel entertainment, laughing at Marcus's jokes and encouraging his behavior through their silence. Now they realized that their own futures might be in jeopardy as well. "Coach, please," Marcus's voice cracked with desperation. I didn't mean it. I was just showing off. It won't happen again, I promise. You're right, Coach Williams replied grimly. It won't happen again, because effective immediately, you're suspended from the team indefinitely. Turn in your jersey, your equipment, and your captain's armband. You're done. The words hit the parking lot like a thunderclap. Marcus's legs nearly gave out beneath him as the full impact of the coach's decision sank in. No team meant no college scholarship. No college scholarship meant no future in football. Everything he had worked for, everything that defined him, had just been taken away with a few simple words. You can't do this, Marcus shouted, his desperation turning to anger. I'm your best player. The team needs me. We have the championship game next week. The team needs leaders, not bullies, Coach Williams replied calmly. And as for the championship game, we'll find a way to win without someone who thinks it's acceptable to torment elderly veterans for entertainment. Robert watched the exchange with mixed feelings. He had no desire to see a young person's future destroyed, even one who had treated him so poorly. But he also understood that some lessons could only be learned through real consequences, and that Coach Williams was trying to teach not just Marcus, but every other student watching about the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. The parking lot had gone completely silent except for the sound of Marcus's ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic. The golden afternoon that had started so promisingly had turned into a nightmare that would haunt him for years to come. As he stood there facing the destruction of everything he had thought was guaranteed, Marcus began to understand that his actions had consequences he had never imagined possible. The days following Marcus's suspension passed like a blur of humiliation and regret. Word of the incident spread through Riverside High like wildfire, carried by social media posts, whispered conversations, and the video footage that several students had captured on their phones. The boy who had once walked the hallways like a king now found himself an outcast, avoided by former admirers and pitted by teachers who had once celebrated his achievements. Marcus's parents, wealthy business owners who had always solved their son's problems with money or influence, were furious when they learned what had happened. They stormed into the principal's office, demanding that Coach Williams be fired and threatening lawsuits against the school district. But Principal Martinez, who had served in the Navy before entering education, stood firmly behind his coach's decision. Your son needs to learn that talent doesn't excuse cruelty, Principal Martinez told Marcus's parents during a heated meeting. If we reverse this decision, we're teaching every student in this school that success gives them the right to treat others poorly. That's not a lesson I'm willing to teach. Marcus spent his suspension at home, watching his former teammates practice through the fence that surrounded the school's athletic facilities. Jake Morrison, the backup quarterback who had always been overshadowed by Marcus's talent, was now taking snaps with the first team. The other players seemed to be rallying around their new leader, working harder than Marcus had ever seen them work before. During his exile, Marcus found himself thinking constantly about Robert Shun. The old man's quiet dignity in the face of such cruel treatment haunted him, making Marcus realize how little he actually knew about the people who surrounded him every day. He began to research veterans online, reading stories about the challenges they faced when returning from war and the difficulties many experienced finding their place in civilian society. One evening, while scrolling through social media posts about his suspension, Marcus came across a comment from Lisa Park, a quiet girl from his history class who had never spoken to him before. My grandfather was a Korean War veteran who worked as a janitor after he came home, she had written. He was the strongest, bravest man I ever knew. Maybe if some people took time to actually know the people they're making fun of, they'd understand what real strength looks like. The comment hit Marcus harder than any lecture from his parents or punishment from school. He realized that he had spent 4 years walking through the hallways of Riverside High without truly seeing the people around him. The janitors, cafeteria workers, secretaries, and other support staff were just part of the background scenery in his privileged world, invisible servants who existed solely to make his life more convenient. That night, Marcus asked his mother about their own family's history. He discovered that his grandfather had served in World War II, fighting in the Pacific Theater before coming home to work in a factory and raise 6 children. His grandmother had worked as a seamstress to help support the family, taking in extra work during the evenings to make ends meet. The comfortable life that Marcus had always taken for granted had been built on the sacrifices and hard work of people he had never bothered to learn about. Meanwhile, at school, Coach Williams was preparing his team for the biggest game of the season without their star quarterback. The coach had received calls from college recruiters asking about Marcus's status, and he had been honest about the situation. Some coaches had expressed interest in giving Marcus a second chance, but others had crossed him off their lists entirely, unwilling to take a risk on a player with character issues. Jake Morrison was struggling under the pressure of leading the team, but his teammates were supporting him in ways they had never supported Marcus. The cruel incident in the parking lot had served as a wake-up call for many of them, forcing them to examine their own behavior and the culture they had created around their star player. "I should have said something," confessed Tyler Brooks, the team's center, during a team meeting. "We all should have said something. We just stood there and let it happen because we were too scared to stand up to Marcus." Coach Williams used the moment to teach a lesson about courage and leadership. Real strength isn't about how far you can throw a football or how many touchdowns you can score, he told his players. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves and treating everyone with dignity and respect. The team voted to dedicate their next game to all the veterans who worked at their school, including Robert Chin. They arranged for a special ceremony before the game, honoring the service members who had sacrificed so much for their freedom. The gesture was both a tribute to those who deserved recognition and an acknowledgement of how badly they had failed in their responsibilities as leaders and role models. Robert Chun, meanwhile, continued his work at the school with the same quiet dignity he had always shown. He received dozens of cards and letters from students apologizing for their silence during the incident and thanking him for his service. Many students began stopping to talk with him during their lunch breaks, asking about his experiences and sharing their own stories with him. The veteran was touched by the outpouring of support, but he was more concerned about Marcus than anyone else. Robert had seen the pain and confusion in the boy's eyes during the confrontation, recognizing a young person who had lost his way rather than someone who was truly malicious. He knew that shame and isolation could either teach valuable lessons or drive someone deeper into bitterness and resentment. One afternoon, Robert made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He asked Principal Martinez for Marcus's home address, explaining that he wanted to have a conversation with the boy who had caused such upheaval. The principal was hesitant at first, concerned about potential complications, but Robert's sincere desire to help eventually convinced him to provide the information. That evening, as Marcus sat in his room scrolling through college recruitment websites that no longer seemed relevant to his future, he heard the doorbell ring. His mother answered the door, and Marcus heard her surprised voice speaking with someone in the front hallway. A few minutes later, she knocked on his bedroom door with an expression of confusion and concern. "Marcus," she said softly, "there's someone here to see you. It's Mr. Chun, the man from your school." Marcus's heart began racing as he realized that Robert had come to his house. Part of him wanted to hide, to avoid facing the man he had treated so cruelly. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger during his suspension, knew that he needed to face the consequences of his actions and try to make things right. He walked downstairs on unsteady legs, preparing for the conversation that would either begin his redemption or confirm his complete transformation into the type of person he was beginning to realize he never wanted to become. Robert Chun sat in the Thompson family's living room, his posture straight and his hands folded in his lap, looking completely out of place among the expensive furniture and pristine decorations. Marcus's parents hovered nearby, uncertain whether to stay or give the two men privacy for what promised to be an uncomfortable conversation. Marcus descended the stairs slowly, his usual confidence replaced by nervous uncertainty. When he entered the living room and saw Robert sitting there calmly, Memories of that awful afternoon flooded back with crushing intensity. The shame he'd been carrying for days threatened to overwhelm him completely. Mr. Chun, Marcus's mother began awkwardly. Would you like some coffee or— Thank you, ma'am, but I'm fine, Robert replied politely. I was hoping to speak with Marcus privately, if that's all right with everyone. Marcus's father looked like he wanted to object, but something in Robert's calm demeanor convinced him to respect the request. We'll be in the kitchen if you need anything, he said, guiding his wife out of the room and leaving the two alone. The silence stretched between them for several long moments. Marcus couldn't bring himself to make eye contact, staring instead at his hands while Robert waited patiently for him to find his voice. Finally, the elderly veteran spoke in the same quiet tone he had used in the parking lot. I didn't come here to make you feel worse, son. I came because I think we need to talk. Marcus looked up, surprised by the kindness in Robert's voice. He had expected anger, maybe even threats of legal action, but not this gentle approach from a man he had treated so terribly. I don't understand, Marcus said quietly. Why would you want to talk to me? After what I did to you? Robert leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Because you remind me of someone I used to know. A young soldier in my unit named Danny Martinez. Smart kid, talented, lots of potential. But he had grown up privileged, never really faced any real challenges or consequences. Sound familiar? Marcus nodded reluctantly, recognizing the description despite his discomfort. Danny thought the world owed him something, Robert continued. He treated the local villagers poorly, made cruel jokes about the other soldiers who came from working-class families. He figured his college education and his family's money made him better than everyone else around him. What happened to him? Marcus asked, genuinely curious despite himself. Robert's expression grew sad. He got 3 good men killed because he was too arrogant to listen to advice from soldiers who had more experience than he did. He thought he knew better than everyone else, right up until the moment his mistakes cost people their lives. The weight of the story settled on Marcus like a heavy blanket. He could see the parallel Robert was drawing, and it terrified him to think that his own arrogance might lead to similar consequences. I'm not saying you're going to get anyone killed, Robert clarified, reading Marcus's expression. But I am saying that the attitude you showed in that parking lot, that belief that you're better than other people, that's a dangerous path to walk down. It leads to a life where you never really connect with anyone, never really understand what matters, and never really grow into the person you could become. Marcus felt tears building in his eyes, though he fought to hold them back. I don't know how to fix this, he whispered. Everyone hates me. My coach won't even look at me. The college scouts aren't returning my parents' calls. I've ruined everything. Have you? Robert asked gently. Or have you just finally hit a wall that your talent and privilege couldn't break through? Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a young person is learning that their actions have real consequences. But my whole future was football, Marcus protested. Without that, I don't know who I am or what I'm supposed to do. Robert smiled for the first time since entering the house. That's probably the most honest thing you've said in years. Most people spend their whole lives trying to figure out who they are beyond their job or their reputation. You're 17 years old. You have time to become someone worth being. How? Marcus asked desperately. How do I become someone different? How do I fix what I broke? Well, Robert said slowly, you could start by learning about the people around you instead of just using them as background scenery for your own life. You could volunteer somewhere, do some work that doesn't benefit you directly. You could read some books about service and sacrifice, understand what those concepts really mean. Marcus nodded eagerly, grasping at the possibility of redemption. I'll do all of that. I'll do anything you think might help. But most importantly, Robert continued, you need to understand that changing who you are isn't something you do to get your football career back or to impress college scouts. You do it because treating people with dignity and respect is the right thing to do, regardless of what you get out of it. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began the slow process of rebuilding his character from the ground up. He volunteered at a veterans shelter, listening to stories from men and women who had served their country and were now struggling with homelessness and mental health issues. He read books about military history and sacrifice, gaining a new appreciation for the courage and dedication of those who served. Most importantly, he began treating the support staff at his school like human beings rather than invisible servants. He learned their names, asked about their families, and expressed genuine interest in their lives and experiences. The transformation was gradual but noticeable, and slowly, some of his classmates began to see him in a different light. Coach Williams watched Marcus's efforts with cautious optimism. After 6 weeks, he called the young man into his office for a conversation that would determine whether redemption was possible. "I've been hearing good things about you," the coach said carefully. "People tell me you're volunteering, treating others with more respect, actually making an effort to become a better person." "I am," Marcus replied simply. "Not because I want anything back, but because it's what I should have been doing all along." Coach Williams studied him for a long moment. "The season's over, Marcus. We lost the championship game, though Jake did better than anyone expected. But if you keep working on yourself, keep showing that this change is real and permanent, maybe we can talk about next season." Marcus nodded, understanding that he was being given a chance he didn't deserve but was grateful to receive. "Thank you, Coach. I won't waste this opportunity." 6 months later, Marcus stood at his high school graduation, no longer the star athlete everyone had expected him to be, but something perhaps more valuable, a young man who had learned about humility, service, and the true meaning of strength. Robert Chun was in the audience, proud of the transformation he had witnessed and hopeful about the future that lay ahead for a boy who had finally learned what it meant to be a man. The college scholarship Marcus had once taken for granted never materialized, but he had found something more important, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal glory and an understanding that true leadership meant lifting others up rather than tearing them down. It had taken the worst moment of his young life to teach him the most important lesson he would ever learn, but sometimes that's exactly what it takes to save a soul that's lost its way.